I'm Pamela Young, and this is Thrive 2030, brought to you by growthcurv. It's my great pleasure today to welcome John Denton, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Hello, John. How are you today?
Very well, very well. A big hello from Paris.
And bonjour back to you, John. Very nice to see you. You to highlight for us what were the major challenges that you saw across Asia Pacific region in the last 18 months.
But what we actually saw in Asia Pacific was the economic impact actually of COVID-19 before the actual physical impact. And of course that's moved around in an asynchronous nature as well. The classic example is in Bangladesh.
When you say you saw the economic impact before the physical impact, you mean before people started getting very sick?
Yeah, that's right. In fact,
okay, can you just explain that?
So a classic, let's just have a look at a value chain like the garment value chain. You saw people being put out of work in Bangladesh, not because COVID-19 had actually taken off in Bangladesh at the time. Yes. It's because COVID-19 and its impact was actually being felt in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in the US, and you had lockdowns, closed downs, etc. And so what you saw there was the whole value chain was interrupted.
Can you give us some examples, John, of what the governments are doing to interrupt the supply chain? Are you talking about locking down, border control?
Yeah, but even on phytosanitary, but even on vaccines. So, as I said, I'm on the COVAX, I'm the private sector rep on the COVAX Council. And so we take the view at the ICC, if you want to grow the economy, in this context, you have to bring the pandemic to an end. And if you want to bring the pandemic to an end, you actually have to enable access to vaccines, okay? Yeah. And as you probably know, there are still countries in the world where less than I think 0.2% of people are vaccinated. Yes. And people wonder why there are new derivations of COVID-19 blowing back. It's because it's mutating. So we've been pushing very hard for access to vaccines. Now,
to that point about the focus on SMEs at the Indonesian conference or the Indonesian hosted event next year. I'm very excited to hear that there's some focus on SMEs, because over the last decade I've become very conscious of many of the global initiatives. The winners seem to be the big businesses who always get the invites to the top table, who get on their trade missions, who can afford to go because they've got the funding and the bigger marketing budget. Do you have any forward insights into what that conference will be discussing, what the aims will be to help the SMEs? Why are they making it the focus? And what do you think, from your perspective, what do you think are the major three things that could be done to improve the ability of SMEs to be effective?
Of course, it has to be a focus, and particularly for Indonesia, because the almost like 92%, I think it is, of Indonesian economy is SME. And SMEs and micro SMEs are also not just in Jakarta. They're in farming communities. They're small traders.
Of course they are. But so what would be the objective? What are we trying to achieve for them at that conference?
So how do you enable the effective functioning of the real economy? I mean, that's the ultimate question. And if you look at what SMEs need, the first thing is, and what you've seen as a consequence of COVID, has been a real drying up of access to finance. So SMEs need access to finance.
Yes, I'm just wondering, as you're talking about that, what the members of the G20 will think about that as in terms of the priority of all the other things that they need to be thinking about in a pandemic. Presumably we will just be coming out of the pandemic at the time of this conference next year. They'll have so many other things on their radar. How do you think that topic's going to rate?
Indonesia, as the leader, can help determine what the agenda is. And the agenda is determined by what the Indonesian priorities will be, and obviously in concert with other G20 countries. What we want to do is ensure that Indonesia, as the leader of the G20, having said it wants to focus on enabling the real economy, enabling the SMEs, we give them the tools to do that.
Last question on that, because I know you've got a time deadline. You've mentioned vaccines. What is the likelihood that we can get the whole world vaccinated? Is that possible, do you think?
It's absolutely possible. I mean, the first thing that has to happen is, just in terms of relatively easy steps is COVAX needs to be fully funded, which is the principal agency, principal entity which is responsible for ensuring access to vaccines, particularly for developing countries. It's still $18 to $20 billion short in terms of the necessary funding. Now, that sounds like a big number, but it's actually a drop in the ocean of what governments have actually already invested in terms of propping up economies.
What is the next global meeting where that topic will come up, where you might be able to organise, for people to provide that money to vaccinate the rest of the world so that we can all move on?
The Italian G20 Summit will be held later this year, because they know this ultimately, if you want to grow the global economy, you have to bring the pandemic to an end, and you can only bring the pandemic to an end by actually ensuring equitable access to vaccines, and we need to work on that. Increase production, access to supply chains.